Ken Duckworth is the Chief Medical Officer of the National Alliance on Mental Illness and has worked with NAMI since 2003. Ken is board certified in adult psychiatry and child and adolescent psychiatry and is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He was previously acting commissioner and medical director at the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health. Ken has worked on an assertive community treatment team, at an early psychosis program, at an elementary school, at a health plan, and with people who are unhoused. His passion for this work comes from his loving dad who had bipolar disorder. And Ken lives in Boston. Again, thank you so much, Ken, for joining us and presenting to us. Dr. Duckworth has a presentation that he'll give. We'll ask that you hold your questions until after the presentation. However, if you'd like to put them in the chat along the way, if you think of a question, feel free to do that. We just won't get to them until after Dr. Duckworth's presentation. So with that, again, welcome, Ken, and take it away.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for that introduction, Craig. Jessica, thank you for reaching out to me. I've said yes to every single NAMI affiliate that has asked me to give a talk. That's how we've sold 40,000 books, right? You sell them one book at a time. So thank you. So what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about our first book and, how it came to pass, what's in it, who's in it. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the next book, which I'm not writing, thankfully. NAMI's going to have a second book. And then I'm going to take your questions. So it should be about 20 minutes in all presentation-wise. So with any luck, Jessica is going to show the first slide. So, this was kind of the ultimate COVID project. I wanted to write NAMI's book for about 10 years, and I had made drafts on it. I went to a class at Harvard called Writing for Medical Professionals. I went 4 years in a row. I was like the worst student ever. The first year I went, I thought there's no way I can write this book. The second year I went, I'm like, those guys aren't that fantastic. The third year, a guy gets up and talks about zits and how his dermatologic book was a hit. And by the fourth year, I'm like, something, I'm going to try to write this book. Then the pandemic happened and Dan Gillison became our CEO. Two things were critical there. I had the support of a leader, and the pandemic made mental health a we thing, not a they thing, right? And so I recognized that there was a market for the book. So these are screenshots. Throughout my little talk, you're going to see screenshots of the 130 people I interviewed for our book. All of them use their names. All of them share where they're from, what they're about, what they have learned. When I would walk through bookstores, I was always so impressed that there was never a book that honored what individuals had learned, what families had learned. And you learn different things and hanging out at NAMI than you do hanging out in psychiatric training and hanging out with medical professionals. So these are slide set. The woman who's fourth from the left on the second row, that's Eleanor Owen. She was the last person alive at the first NAMI convention. She was 100 years old when I interviewed her. She has since passed away. But I also realized that I had kind of a moment of NAMI's history, that Joyce Burland is in her 80s, that Eleanor Owen was at the first convention. Lori Flynn was happy to talk about how she gobbled the NIMH budget in the decade of the brain. So while writing NAMI's first book, I wanted to be respectful of the history, but the book is not our history. This is a practical book designed to help people. It could have helped me, and it could have helped my family. Let's go to the next slide, Jessica. All right, so you know all about what NAMI is, so I'm not going to develop this now, but I just want to thank you for everything you're doing in Santa Fe. One of the main reasons I wrote this book is so many people have told me if only I knew about NAMI sooner, it would have saved my marriage or improved my relationship with my family member. So the fact that we're in every Target, the fact that we're in your local bookstore, the fact that we're in libraries. In fact, I gave a talk to the Oklahoma City chapter of NAMI, And a woman raised her hand and said, all 20 copies of You Are Not Alone are checked out in Oklahoma City right now. So, there's kind of some very gratifying moments along the way, and that was one of them. Let's go to the next slide, please. If you look at all the classes and educational programs that we run, support groups, it almost begs the question, how on earth didn't we have a book? But I went out of my way to find the people who were involved in these programs. I interviewed a woman whose life was saved by In Her Own Voice. I interviewed Joyce Berland, who invented Family to Family. I interviewed a woman who started the largest NAMI on campus at a major prestigious university. I interviewed Brenda Hilligoss, who invented Ending the Silence, Catherine McNulty, who invented peer-to-peer. The idea of these programs is these are free programs that are helping a lot of people, and some of them have an evidence base. That is to say, randomized controlled trials have shown them to be helpful. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so what's radical about our book is the part on the right, experience-based evidence, that if you've lived with bipolar disorder for 20 years, or if you've loved someone who's had schizophrenia, or you've been misdiagnosed and told by a professional that you would never get better, that's experience. If a dog has made a difference in your life, if becoming a peer has made a difference, transcranial magnetic stimulation, ketamine, all these different people told me all these different things and what they did for them. On the left side of the book is a little more traditional, evidence-based research, but as NAMI's doctor, I know all the researchers across the country. And so, as you know, I've been working our conventions for many years, and people would ask me the same questions over and over and over. So I thought, instead of what the heck Ken Duckworth thinks, why don't I go to the smartest person in the country on that question? So do I really have to take these meds forever? Well, I went right to the king of bipolar disorder. How do I get a family member to seek help? You probably know William Miller, who invented motivational interviewing. He's at the University of New Mexico. He was happy to write an essay. Is clozapine a drug of last resort? How do you talk to somebody who says, I'm not sick, I don't need help? What is cognitive behavior therapy for voices? Again, over and over. So what I did is I tried to combine on the left the best researchers in the country, getting 500 words at a time. What are my rights in the workplace? What are my rights in housing? Integrated with, how did people integrate a diagnosis? How do they communicate in their family? How did they build a life? How did they find meaning in their lives? That's the beauty of our book. And it did work out really well. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Let's go to the next slide, please, Jessica. All right, this is a website which shows where I'm going across America. I've done more than 100 book events, some in person and some virtual. And I've tried to say yes to all of them. This also has a podcast where if you're interested in people in the book, I took 20 of them and I did more elaborate interviews with them. Like, how did you learn how to integrate this into your family? How did you deal with the fact, that you were ashamed of this particular vulnerability? How did you as a parent learn to let go and love your son? And how did that work out for you? So NAMI now has 2 podcasts. One is called You Are Not Alone, Voices of Recovery. And of course, Dan's podcast, Hope Starts With Us. So NAMI now has 2 podcasts up and running. It's kind of fun. Let's go to the next slide. But if you want to know where I am, that's the website. All right, so that guy with the enormous ears on the left, that's me at about age 7, when I first realized that my dad, when carted away by the police and hearing voices, had a major mental illness. This experience of having a loving, sick, shaped my entire professional life. And if I wasn't, a psychiatrist, I would have been very happy as a history teacher or a journalist. So it doesn't probably surprise you that the book I was interested in was a book of stories, not a deep-end neuroscience book. So my story is not my memoir, but I wanted to make it clear that I'm part of this community. All right, let's go to the next slide. So I did 130 interviews with individuals living with a mental health condition and families. Everybody uses their real name. Everybody shares their stories. I then asked the smartest researchers in the country the most frequently asked questions that I get. All proceeds go to NAMI, and NAMI has the copyright. So this book is going to be a perennial. And one of the reasons I've, gone to all the corners of America, virtually and in person, I want people to know about it. So when somebody gets a diagnosis or feels hopeless or feels alone, that they recognize there are, really millions of people like them across the country. Let's go to the next slide. So basically, I had an interview protocol. I had an IRB, an Institutional Review Board, review it. I collaborated with people at Yale who did qualitative analysis. I spoke to each person by the phone, not a real Zoom interview. And I said, are you sure you want to do this? Because this book is completely different than every other book. Instead of the psychiatrist saying, my patients are my greatest teachers, but no one in this book is a real person, I didn't want that. I actually wanted to flip that on its head. I wanted real people and real families to be the center of the book. Zoom gave me the gift of allowing me to take transcripts and say, oh my God, that's an incredible quote. And then I would send it to the person. I'd say, is it okay if we include your quote with your name in the book? Because I think that illustrates something very profound. And they would say yes. One or two people said, could we adjust the quote? I said, it's your words. This is book of your experience. And then I asked people to identify themselves. 12 people said they were Black, 12 said they were African American. The idea is you say who you are. Some were Hispanic, some were Latino. And the beauty of the project is that people said who they were in their own words. All right, let's go to the next slide, Jessica. All right, so here we go in terms of our states. We have 38 states. If this was an election, we would have won handily. 11 self-identified race and ethnicities across the spectrums of gender and sexuality, 25 different faith orientations, 50 occupations, ages 16 to 100. One woman said she was older than dirt. So it's not perfect geographic representation, but it's pretty good. And if I were to do another one, I could easily fill the rest of the country. Somebody had to interview people from Hawaii so that I could go to Hawaii and do the book tour. So that was a critical element of it. I'm like, wait a minute, somebody's from Hawaii and wants to be in the book. Let's go. Next slide, please. Part one of the book is mental health and mental health conditions. You can see the chapters. I really tried to do some things that would push NAMI a little farther. I felt that we could be stronger on co-occurring addiction. There's a chapter on that. I wanted us to be stronger on trauma. There's a chapter on that. I wanted us to do more with youth, so there's a chapter on that. The second part of the book, I asked people what recovery meant to them. How much peers made a difference for people was an enormous takeaway. The chapter on culture, people talked about their church, their workplace, what their ethnicity meant to them, and then becoming an advocate. In part three, I asked families very similar questions. I had a section on the legal system with a lawyer, the policy director of NAMI, Ron Honberg, wrote that with me. The hardest family questions. What do I do if my family member doesn't think they need help? What if I've lost communication with my family? What happens after I die? How will I care for my adult child? And when I interviewed people, people touched upon these issues. I also feel that NAMI could be stronger on supporting people who've lost family members who've died by suicide. Even with all the love in the world, just as with cancer, People don't always make it. And I didn't want them to feel alone, because one of the things that I've heard over the years at NAMI is what a heartache that has been for families. So I also interviewed the medical director of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention in her own journey. And I also had her ask an expert question: how do I talk to somebody who's suicidal? And the best practices is I simply ask the best researchers in the country all the questions that I mentioned to you earlier, 35 of them in all. The goal was to create a practical, a loving book that represents who we are as a community and is genuinely in service to helping people. Let's go to the next slide. Jessica.
Hold on, Dr. Duckworth, I just want to pipe in here. Jessica, if you could go back to the previous slide real quickly. I just want to add here, this is what I found out. If you could, the previous slide, if you can get there, Jessica.
Yeah, sorry.
Page up or up. Well,
You kept going forward, my friend.
yep. So what, there we go. We're getting there. So what I found really helpful and really neat about your book, Dr. Duckworth, is that you don't necessarily need to read it cover to cover. If you're interested in or concerned about one of these topics that are on here, you can zoom right there and read that chapter and get a lot out of it, which I found very helpful, from the best practices to the particularly the section on substance use and you know, addictions and things like that, that the reader or someone who owns this book can just, you know, sort of pick and choose which areas maybe they're particularly interested in the moment. And I just found that to be really helpful, that, you know, they don't necessarily have to sit down and read a 350-page book in, you know, in the course of a couple of weeks.
Right. If you're interested in family communication, you turn to that chapter. You're trying to figure out how to battle the legal system as a family member, turn to that chapter.
Yeah.
So again, I think it's really important. You can read this book cover to cover, or you can use it as the most friendly reference guide ever.
Exactly.
That was my intention.
Yeah.
And people read it in different ways.
Yep. Yeah. It's very accessible and readable too. So thank you. And thank you for that.
Could I interject here? If anybody is not muted, would they please mute themselves? Because I feel like we're getting some noise.
All right, we're almost done with the chat. We can go to your conversations. Let's keep going, Jessica. All right, these are some examples of people that I involved. There's William Miller. How do I help my family members see they need help? William Miller from the University of New Mexico invented motivational interviewing. 200 randomized controlled trials. That's one example. On the family section there on the left, what is the Wellness Recovery Action Plan and how does it work? Well, I went to Mary Ellen Copeland, who invented it, right? So the idea of the book is I kind of went to the OG person, the original person. Is a job of mental health intervention. Bob Drake and his wife invented it, you know, individual placement and support. Do I really have to take these meds forever? That's the most common question I've been asked at NAMI, other than how do I help my family member who doesn't see that they're sick? How do we get better treatments? Well, I went to the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, Josh Gordon. And, you know, why should we participate in research? And then back on the left side under family, is my teenager just being a teenager, or do they need an evaluation? That's Christine Crawford. She's my understudy at National NAMI, and she's writing the next book, which gives me great joy to be mentoring her and great joy that I don't have to blow out my elbow tendons again, which I did writing this book. This is a guide for parents, teens, and youth. Christine is using the same model. She's interviewing real parents, real teens, real youth, and real experts in the areas of all the things that you care about for teens. That book will come out in about 16 months. So the fall of 24. And let's go to the next slide. All right, so when I have two hands on my head there, that's when the publisher said we couldn't have a 650-page book, and we had to cut 200 pages. It was a brutal day. Jordan Miller, my co-pilot, she thought it was kind of hilarious, and my other helper, just thought, this is just life of the absurd. The acknowledgments, I want to give you an idea of how many people it took to build this book. It was my idea. I took a year off and did nothing but work. I'm the one that blew out my elbows. But I want to show you all the people inside of NAMI and outside of NAMI who helped to bring our book to reality. Our book was a USA Today bestseller, won 2 awards, has been translated into Mandarin, has been resold in the United Kingdom, and has sold well over 40,000 books, which is stupendously good for a so-called self-help book. It's incredible, actually. Our publisher kind of can't believe it, and neither can our agent. So it's been a wild success because of you. You're interested in promoting NAMI. When people say, what can I do? I say, go to your local library and see if they bought the book, right? And of course, we're giving it to each other. I had a woman send me an email. Her son developed bipolar disorder. She said, nobody's allowed to talk to Tony until you buy this book. So she bought 10 copies of the book and sent them around. And like, that's the way we're doing this. We're going to treat Tony with love and respect. He's not to be afraid of. Look at what he's going through. So to me, it's been a great project. NAMI has been an incredible, co-traveler with me on this adventure. So let's take a look at the next slide. These are the names of all the people who shared what they learned to help other people. And I want you to know, when I interviewed people and I said, what was this like for you? People said, if my journey helps one other person, it will all be worth it. One after another said that. One person said it was liberating. I've been hearing voices for 30 years, and finally, I'm going to tell the world about it and what I'm doing to deal with it. Like, it's liberating to take this experience of secrecy and just go large with it to help others. So that's my last slide. Jessica, we can do Q&A now. Thank you for staying with me. And let's talk about anything you want to talk about related to our first book.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Duckworth. And really, kudos, congratulations on how successful and used the book has already been. And thank you for putting it together. Clearly, it was clear that it took a village of lots of people to put that together. But the fact that you buckled down and dedicated a year to it, we're all very grateful for that.
Well, I've gone gray, Craig, and I wasn't going to retire, which I have no intention of doing, without giving the largest and best mental health group in the world our first book. It just seemed unbelievable to me. And it took me about 10 years, and some things are just worth the wait.
Yeah, it's really good. So I want to encourage our audience members to ask Dr. Duckworth questions. Feel free to do so in the chat, or go down to the bottom where it says reactions and click on raise your hand, and we'll call on you with your little yellow hand raised. I'll kick off a question. I know that Jessica has a question or two, and sitting next to Jessica is Tom Stark, who probably has a few questions as well. Let's see, I had a question that I really wanted to ask. Here's a quote from the book, early on in the book, quote, "The most helpful things we've learned about mental health conditions are from people with lived experience, what are often we call peers. What do you feel are the most insightful or profound things we've learned, Dr. Duckworth, from those that have dealt with a mental illness?"
Well, that's kind of, about a third of the book. I learned so much about dogs and healing. I was never once discussed in my psychiatry training. So I moved to Harvard. I went to the top of the mountain. I met amazing people. No one ever said what a dog can do. And I ran into 2 people, not one. One who said the dog regulated his schedule to help him with bipolar disorder. One woman who said she'd been sexually assaulted in the military, and the dog was a service animal and kept people at bay. When she was anxious, the dog would get closer to the guy When she was comfortable, the dog would let the person closer to her. That's just an example of something that no psychiatrist knows.
Yeah.
Catherine McNulty was living with a mental health condition, went to a peer group and said, I'm having trouble running my life. The dishes are stacked up 5 feet high in the sink, and I feel like I'm going to lose my kids. And a woman at a peer group said, forget the dishes. I'm going to give you 2 words that'll change your life. Paper plates. Now, has any mental health professional ever given that advice? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So to me, the other thing that I was impressed by, so Craig, it won't surprise you that I'm way out on the peer end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
As psychiatrists go, like I'm in the 98th percentile. But when you actually interview 80 people who identify as peers, what you realize is even I had underestimated how powerful the peer experience is. So when you write a book proposal. It's an 81-page book proposal, got 5 bids. Like the whole thing was just unbelievable for a rookie author. But I think people really wanted NAMI to have a book. The publisher who got the book, Molly Stern, she edited Michelle Obama's Becoming. And her social worker sister-in-law said, I've been waiting for NAMI to have a book. So I think that kind of sealed the deal. But if Molly Stern didn't exist, Simon & Schuster, Hachette, HarperCollins, Public Interest, people wanted our book. I want to emphasize that. But in my book proposal, I wrote one of the chapters tentatively as the power of community. Yeah. And I had to change it to the power of peers and community because so many people talked about what they learned from each other and how giving to other people as peer specialists, as teachers in our programs, was like the linchpin of their own recovery. And it might seem obvious to you now, but I, even as a 98th percentile leaning towards the peer world, I wasn't integrating that fully. That was a great lesson for me. And I feel very blessed that I got to do this work to learn from real people.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just to quickly elaborate on that from my own personal experience about the power of getting feedback and input from those with lived experience. I know I've found when I've been struggling with my depression and have been in active recovery and treatment that while I've gotten a lot out of individual therapy, I actually get a lot more out of group therapy and support groups. And that whole notion of the book, which is you are not alone. It's in group therapy where I really feel like I'm not alone because there's 8 or 9 other people dealing with similar mental health issues that I am. And it made me feel really comforting that I wasn't alone.
Exactly. And this idea, the book is very both and. Yeah. Clozapine might help with your voices, but then being part of a community might help you build a life.
Yeah.
It's not an either or book. It's not anti-professional. You know, I've been asked that question on multiple podcasts across America. I'm like, I'm a psychiatrist. I love all that stuff. But in hanging around at NAMI, I learned about a whole nother dimension that all the other books had ignored, which is that real people have also learned stuff. Yeah. And why are we leaving all that knowledge, you know, on the table? Let's go. So, Craig, thanks for saying that. And that kind of comment is why the book, I think, has been such a success. Yeah. And why it helped shape my thinking. That chapter's got to be called The Power of Peers in Community. Yeah. And one person after another tell me, the person they learned from the most was the peers, but they like their psychiatrist and the treatments are helping. But what really made a difference for them was becoming a peer specialist, teaching other people, giving in our own voice presentations, going to the middle school and helping kids who were like them. Nobody attended to them when they were in 9th grade. And here they are doing Ending the Silence in the local school district. Exactly. That's what heals people. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So I'll turn to either Jessica or Tom and see if either of the two of you have a question for Dr. Duckworth.
Yeah, I have a question I really want to ask. And I'm sorry, I heard there's a lot of feedback coming from my microphone. So let me know if that's a problem. But so you wrote about your experience wanting to pursue your career in psychiatry, but you were actually deterred from that because you were told that your motivation, which was understanding your father and wanting to help, him and people like that, wasn't a good motivation. And I actually had similar experiences. I was going to be a psychologist, and I was told, because of my brother's situation with bipolar, it might be too depressing for me to get into the field. So I was wondering if you could say
Now,
more.
how long ago was that, Jessica? You're all
Yeah,
young and everything.
That was probably, I don't know, I'm old now, but, probably like 15 years ago. But yeah, I was wondering why you thought you got that reaction. And if that wasn't a good motivation for pursuing a career, what were they looking for? What would have been?
So I'll tell you that story. So this is 1986. NAMI's 7 or 8 years old. I was very naive. I just wrote the truth. Why did I want to become a psychiatrist was the essay prompt. And apparently the right answer was, I'm interested in what makes people tick, or I want to study human motivation, or I'm fascinated by neuroscience in the brain. Those were the right answers. I wrote the truth, which was I was trying to make sense of how come my father, who would be loving, fun, delightful, take me to see the Detroit Tigers, would be communicating with the microwave. Like, what was this thing and that we couldn't talk about? So you can see I was a natural to connect with NAMI. And so, Jessica, I write this essay, and I go to all the best programs all across America, UCSF, Yale, and everybody ignores my essay. They don't talk about it. Like that was my essay. Every single person ignored my essay. They want to talk about volunteer work. A couple people said, "Oh, you're going to the University of Michigan. How's the football team?" I'm like, "The football team's terrific. Did you read my essay?" Then I go to a world famous hospital in Boston, and the very famous person said, "This is a terrible reason to become a psychiatrist." And now I'm 26 years old. I know no one. I'm not the commissioner of mental health. I'm not the doctor of NAMI, right? I'm not on the Harvard faculty. I'm a kid. And he said, that's a terrible reason to become a psychiatrist. And I say, what is a good reason? And he was a powerful person. I don't think anybody ever asked him a question like that before. And he took a long pause and he said, well, maybe if your father is a psychiatrist. So I left that day in tears. I literally walked to my rental car. I was from Philadelphia and went to Temple Med. And I thought to myself, I actually don't think this is going to work. I actually think I should become a cardiologist. I'll talk to people about their hearts. They drive nicer cars anyway. I had a ton of student loans. Like, I like BMWs. I've never had one, but it seems like it would be a nice thing. All the cardiologists drive Beamers, by the way. You'll notice this if you ever go to a hospital. They make more money than we do. The next day, I go to the place that I'm still on the faculty 100 years later. And the first guy reads my interview and he says, Ken, this is fantastic. You're going to be so much better because you've been through this. And I said, that's it. I'm moving to Boston. I'm still on the faculty of the same place because one person said, this could be an advantage. Now, I think it's much more mixed now. I think people can say it now or talk about it. But I was just told, I was at a medical school and somebody said, my daughter wrote that, her brother's illness was her driver for being medicine. And they're like, we don't want that in here. We want people who are purely interested in medicine. So, Jessica, I'm sorry you had that experience. I just got luck. So I had 19 whiffs, one catastrophic insult, which went right through my soul. And then just one guy, the last of the interview, the 21st interview, he said, this is fantastic. That guy's name is Ned Hallowell. He wrote a book called Driven to Distraction, which sold 1 million books. And literally, he was like one of the inspirations for me to do this book. Because I'm like, hey, that guy can write. Nothing's stopping me.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry you had that experience. They're absolutely wrong, Jessica. If you came to my program, I'd say, tell me more about that and how that has shaped your motivation. That's what I'm interested in. Because what you want is people who care. How people tick is not a very long-term program. Like after 4 years, you're probably going to be half burned out. I'm in this for the same reasons that you are. I know what it's like. That's why I've done my whole career in this work, and I'm not burned out. I cherish it. I believe in the mission. And Jessica, we're lucky to have you at NAMI Santa Fe. And I apologize on behalf of the arrogant professionals
Yeah.
that are writ large. I want you to know I could have written a chapter called Horrible Things Professionals Have Said to Me, but I only took 3 stories. I called it Don't Believe a Negative Prognosis.
Yeah.
If I told you how many people told me, you'll never get better, you should never have kids, you're never going to get out of the hospital. Like, who gave us fortune telling skills?
Yeah, really.
They have no fortune telling classes. We are not that good. I was told by a world famous Harvard professor that a certain patient would never leave the hospital because he was so psychotic. A year later, clozapine comes out. I give the dude clozapine. He's living in the community. And like, did that guy, the world famous guy, say this guy will never live in the community? And then literally a year later, he's living in the community. So we don't do the future. We're not that good. Humility, respect, supporting people's strengths. That's what it's all about. So I apologize on behalf of my arrogant colleagues. And had you, gotten lucky, I got lucky. I had one person say that was a good idea, and I'm going to die on that faculty just because one person said, "Hey, that could be an advantage." I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Because I had violated the unwritten rule. You can't talk about your own experience, right? And of course, it's no coincidence that I end up at NAMI. Like, this is the right team for me.
Yes.
So when other people recruit me to jobs, I'm like, that's hilarious. This is my tribe. I don't want to be the CEO of some stupid hospital system.
Yeah.
What are you talking to me about that?
Yeah.
This is my team. You all understand this, why you're in this mission. This is why I'm in it too.
Yeah.
Long answer, Jessica.
Thanks for that, Dr. Duckworth. We've got a few questions in the chat that I would like to get to from our audience members. And the first one is from Patricia Romero. Patricia, you might need to further clarify this. At least I had trouble understanding it. But her question is, did you hear from any individuals about dealing with individuals with intellectual/mental health diagnosis?
Okay, so co-occurring developmental disabilities. I write in the introduction that I think that deserves its own full book, right? Autistic spectrum disorder, lower IQs, cognitive limitations. And I write, and I have said to people, you want to write that book, I will help you. Like, to me, let's say autistic spectrum disorders. Like, just take that. It's going to be in Christine Crawford's book. That's an entirely different construct. And some parents are learning things. Some parents are trying ABA. Some parents are letting their kids STEM. Some kids are, doing floor time. I'd be very interested in that book. But that hasn't been at the core of NAMI. Some people had co-occurring vulnerabilities in that area, as with eating disorders, not a core NAMI thing.
Yeah.
But whatever people told me is what I wrote down. It's an excellent question, and they deserve their own book. Yeah. And if you want to write it, I'm Ken at NAMI.org. And I know how to do it. I'm telling you, it won't be pretty. But at the end of it, you have it, and it's much more fun to have written than to be writing.
Yeah. Thank you for that. We've got a question from Jonathan Gordon. Jonathan asks, what did you learn about the importance or not of having families being a part of the journey?
Yeah, so a lot of family love in this book. And so there's 3 sections. One is kind of how I understand everything with people's experience integrated into it. When you get 4 different diagnoses, then I'd interview people who'd get 4 different diagnoses. Then there's about 80 pages, first person experience, about 100 pages on family experience. Families are the root of NAMI. I want to emphasize that. We started out as a family organization. Family love, family advocacy, family to family, the education program are kind of some of the core, I would call that the cornerstone of NAMI. People really benefit when they have a loving family, even if they don't appreciate that they have a loving family at different moments in time, which can include years. And taking family to family, the idea that You're here for them. They're not ready for what you have to offer yet, but learning what they've been through in family to family increases your empathy and your capacity for compassion. So I think families are, really the key to most people's recovery. And families isn't always parents. I interviewed a married couple. They both have mental health conditions. I think they both have schizoaffective disorder. And they say, we run our marriage based on NAMI group principles. They're learning how to build a family based on what they learn in our support groups. I interviewed two pairs of siblings, one in their 60s and one in their 20s. And how did they navigate the experience of sibling life? Now, obviously, every individual story is an N of one, but many people over the years have said to me, NAMI has neglected the sibling relationship. I'm the child of a person with a psychotic illness, and I interviewed several others. The idea is this could happen to anyone, right? You are not alone. If you're a parent, if you're a husband, a spouse, a child, a sibling, best friend, family by choice. There was a woman who was very clear that her family, she had abandoned her family because they rejected her sexuality. She had a family by choice. And then we interviewed the guy who was her family of choice, right? So families are critical. And I love that chapter, family communication, in part because my family never figured it out. So we're in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And the strategy then was don't talk about it under any circumstances. Whatever you do, don't talk about it. This prevents us from learning. This prevents us from preparing. This prevents us from problem solving. One of the reasons I became a psychiatrist. So if I had to pick a chapter I love, it's themes of recovery, family communication. There's a few chapters I just plain old love in this book. And, I go back to them over and over again. And I think about what the people told me and how much they shared.
Great. Thank you. Tom, did you want to ask a question?
Sure. Dr. Duckworth, if you could communicate one thing to a family with a family member in early psychosis, like first episode psychosis, what would you tell them?
Two things. One is read Dr. Keshavan's essay on the coordinated specialty care model. NAMI has advocated for 300 of these programs to be across America. It's not like going to a regular clinic. It's strength-based, it's supportive, it's very engaging on work and school. People do not apply for disability first. So that's critical. And NAMI's advocacy helped to make those happen. That's the practical thing. I volunteered in such a program for 5 years. They're fantastic. The other thing is, this is a marathon. Try not to make definitive decisions about how it's going to be. When you're going through it, you're in acute traumatic experience. Try not to assess your life in the middle of a trauma. Try to do your best to gather support. You're not alone, and stay with this because your young person needs you for the marathon that they are running with you. So coordinated specialty care is the kind of help you get. There's undoubtedly one at the University of New Mexico. There's got to be a first episode of psychosis program, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, perhaps. I can't tell you which one. And then the idea, go to a NAMI meeting and meet with other people. What have they learned? How have they learned to cope? How have they found strength or hope or a new treatment? It is really hard. And my heart goes out to everybody who goes through this, but I chat with families all the time. I say, this is a better model, the better mousetrap. And then try to remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint, even though you are sprinting now.
Great. We've got a question from the participants that's definitely of strong interest to me, coming from Christine. And she asks, what is happening with research of alternative treatments like ketamine or psychedelic drugs, since many bipolar sufferers, including her daughter, stop taking medications such as lithium because they hate how it makes them feel? And I'll just add real quickly, that in my struggles with depression last fall, I had some really good success with ketamine, IV ketamine sessions, and was quite impressed with how much of an improvement I got from it. And I realize that's not true for everybody. But so, Doctor, what's the status of psychedelics and where they are on the being able to be accessible
NAMI
to
as
the
a policy position, we need more research. We need it into cannabis. We need it into marijuana. We need it into psychedelics. As you know, MDMA has been fast-tracked by the FDA as a breakthrough treatment for PTSD. So we're watching that. In the book, I interviewed a woman, Sierra Grandy, that ketamine was the only thing that made a difference for her.
Yeah.
And I had an expert in trauma discuss the growing research on psychedelics. The place that I follow that is MAPS, the Multimodal Association for Psychedelic Studies, the multimodality for the advancement of psychedelic studies, MAPS. These people are running a nonprofit, have been doing it for 30 years, right? We got into very Nancy Reagan, just say no. They're like, hey, wait a minute, these things could have benefit. Dr. Victoria Harris gave a talk on psychedelics at the NAMI convention that might be available online. We need more research. We need to study these things. We need to know for whom they don't work, right? The current thinking is that people with psychosis probably should not be taking psychedelic meds, right? And most of the studies don't involve people with psychosis. So to me, given how hard drug discovery is, I want NAMI to continue to press for this. Ketamine is also super expensive.
Yep.
And Sierra Grandy talked about how hard it was to pay for it.
Yep.
S-ketamine, which is ketamine in a mirror, we're now back to organic chemistry. The racemic version, like yourself in a mirror, is the opposite of you, right? Left side is the right side. So the racemic version is what's called S-ketamine.
Yep.
And like transcranial magnetic stimulation, most health plans will pay for it, but you've got to fight them. I interviewed a man, Marty Parrish, for whom TMS saved his life. And whenever I listen to people, I was like, fantastic. I got somebody ketamine helped. I have somebody that TMS helped. I had somebody that EMDR helped for trauma. The idea is different things help different people. We don't know what's going to help you. So learning from others, understanding the research is valuable. These compounds have to be taken off of Schedule 1 so they can be studied. This is critical. And that's in the NAMI policy position, which came out 2 months ago. Learn, then act. What we did with marijuana in America is we acted and we're still learning.
Yeah.
This is dumb. Do not do that. Right?
Yeah.
Ready, aim, fire. We did with marijuana, fire, ready, aim. And, under 25, people with family history of psychosis have increased risk of developing a psychosis with marijuana products. What are we doing? There's no labels on them. I've had patients who are PTSD who are veterans say the drugs you give me don't do damn thing for me, but marijuana helps me a lot. And they're in their 60s and they've been, in Operation Desert Storm. And I'm like, if you're in your 60s, let's go. Do what works for you. I'm not going to tell you not to do it, but we should be studying these things.
Yeah.
Good question. These are all good questions.
I have a question that's from your book early on. You've got a section called Helping a Loved One early on. And one of your categories is Think Young. And you write, quote, more than half of all mental health conditions manifest before age 14. That's an astounding and bit alarming statistic. I was fortunate. My first bout of depression wasn't until I was 35. But that really is concerning that so many youth are dealing with their mental health conditions, under age 14. What can parents and pediatricians and the school system do to help with this mental health crisis we're having really with some of our youth?
Buy NAMI's second book coming out in a year, right? Promote it. Like, we're going to be taking the lead on this. We were the first mental health team to have a book, and all the other mental health teams like Mental Health America, like, hey, what's happening? How did you guys pull that off? Well, we did it, right? So Christine's book is going to be interviewing what helps teens, what helps parents, what helps youth. the COVID experience was really hard on youth because they're developmentally driven to be in the world and try things out. You know, try out for sports, be in the play, ask a girl out, get turned down. This is all social learning, right? And they weren't able to do that. So that's why the mental health, anxiety, and depression rates are much higher in teens and young adults than they were pre-pandemic, and they're not snapping back. This is more like a sock that's stretched out as opposed to a rubber band. They're not snapping back. Simple. They're just not. So, there's a lot we could do. The Surgeon General came out with guidelines on social media. The rise in the suicide rate in 2006 correlates exactly with the onset of social media, which is a public way for you to be humiliated or to see that other people are having more fun than you are, right? Most people don't post their worst days. They don't post the day that I put my head on the steering wheel at a very famous hospital and thought, I don't think I could become a psychiatrist. Is it too late to go to cardiology and drive Beamers, right? I know I could help people and they would be fun. They wouldn't care what my story was. I was a good student. So to me, right, you just have to figure out a way to manage social media is one thing. Promote connection is another. But if you look at the Surgeon General's report on social media, people are pretty critical of the impact of social media. Like, don't let your kid take their phone to bed. Like, they get charged, they stay in the kitchen. Now, that doesn't seem like much. Millions of kids are up all night watching TikTok all across America and wondering if they could be as good as that kid or funny as that kid or attractive as that girl, whatever it is, so social media control would be one. And I think Christine Crawford's going to be interviewing social media experts for the next book.
Thank you for that. We've got a question from Veronica. She asks, and we're just almost out of time. We like to keep these roughly close to an hour for everyone's time, respecting people's time. She asks, her son was diagnosed with bipolar 1 and psychosis a couple of weeks ago. When do you tell them they suffer from these illnesses and they really need to take their meds? Her son is 23 years old.
All right. So most 23-year-olds don't want a diagnosis and they don't want to take meds. So the question is, how do you create the conditions? So now this is Bill Miller, motivational interviewing.
Mm-hmm.
Read this section on Bill Miller from the University of New Mexico. What does he want? He would say, don't start with, son, you have bipolar disorder. You need to take your meds. Most people have a committee inside of them. Bill Miller says when you push on one side of the committee, it's like a boat. This is called the righting reflex. The other side says, something, I don't have that. You're just plain wrong. So Bill Miller would say, listen to what he wants. The doctor should be telling him his diagnosis. In general, the family should say, how can we support you in getting a relationship, a job, housing, that sort of thing. And it's okay in some families to say, if you want to live in my house, you're going to have to participate in treatment. Carlos Lorelei in the book said he only took his meds because his mother said, this is what it's going to take for you to live in my house. There is no right answer here. I want to emphasize that. Don't beat yourself up. We're all learning. The most important thing, in my opinion, is to sustain the relationship in a loving and positive way. That's the principal overarching idea. No 23-year-old wants to have bipolar disorder. No 23-year-old. They're forming their identity, and while you're figuring out who you are, you add this whole other thing, which is not cool in our society. Mental health is more acceptable than it's ever been, but it's still not a positive, right, for people. So I'd encourage you to take the family to family class. Read what Bill Miller said in the back of the book. Look at Andy Nierenberg's. Do I really have to take these meds forever? Right? Just take a look at some of the things in the book. And, I wish you the best of luck. And remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And your ability to sustain a positive relationship with him is the most important thing over time.
Great. Thank you for that. I'll use the prerogative of the MC to ask one kind of follow-up question to that in a way before we wrap up. And you state in your book that someone's mental health or mental illness diagnosis can inform your recovery, but it also does not define you. What do you mean by that? What's the significance of making sure that someone's mental illness diagnosis doesn't actually define them as a
Let's
person?
go back to the exact previous question.
Yeah.
Living with bipolar disorder at 23 is not who you are. You are still the person you were before you had those symptoms. The way I see it is good to know your diagnosis so it can help inform treatments, pattern recognition, decision-making. Don't take a job where there's a night shift. Don't work at Amazon. Don't work at UPS. No night shift work for people with bipolar disorder. This is like examples of information that's helpful. But you are not your bipolar disorder. Just as people who develop rheumatoid arthritis are not their rheumatoid arthritis. They're a person with, passions, fears, hopes, and dreams, living with something. So I think the chapter is called The Paradox of Diagnosis. It's important to know your diagnosis, to integrate information, make decisions, right? And inform where you want to go. But you are not your diagnosis. My dad was hospitalized 25 times in my lifetime. I remember him as a loving, gentle, hilarious guy who at the drop of a hat would take you to the ball game, even on a school night before there was an exam. I'm like, well, Woody Fryman's pitching. He's like, let's get in the car. Let's go. Right. I mean, back in the 70s, tickets were 50 cents. I know it's hard to believe, and I remember just thinking, this is the greatest thing ever. I remember him for being a loving, charismatic person. Did he have an illness that led to my entire decision professionally? Yes. But I did it because I loved him, not because he was sick. Do you see the difference?
Yeah.
Right. There was such a mystery. Then I found NAMI. And once I found NAMI, I'm like, I can turn this pain into purpose, just as you all have.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that perspective of you are not your illness or you are not your diagnosis is really important with respect to minimizing and getting rid of the stigma, having those of us that deal with a mental illness, not deal with the shame or embarrassment of having one, things like that. So
this is why I wanted real people in the book, because there's somebody just like you. And if you want, I'll reach out to them for you. Yeah. Trevor McCauley dropped out of the University of Michigan because he had a manic episode. And he drove 200 miles to my book event in Ann Arbor, brought his whole family. And his wife comes up to me and she says, Trevor's been waiting 8 months for this moment. 2 adorable kids. And she said, I just want you to know, Trevor feels that he is living well with this, but he doesn't deny that he has it. That's a good example of a guy who drops out of the University of Michigan, walks 3 miles to a hospital, manic and psychotic. So if you wanted to reach out to Trevor McCauley, who's now in his 30s, he's a real person. He exists. I can connect. If your son said, I want to talk to somebody like me, obviously there's support groups, but there's also people in the book who felt that they had lost everything. I want to emphasize this. One of the things about this line of work is doctors see you in snapshot. They tend to be pathologizing. People live in a movie. And your strengths, your ability to form relationships, your sense of humor, your love of baseball, all these things are part of who you are. You're not your diagnosis. Yeah. But it's a good idea to know your diagnosis. If you have a trauma history, you may not want to become a police officer. Again, information about your own mental health is power, but it's not definitive. Excellent questions all the way around. Yeah. Thank you, NAMI Santa Fe. When I come out to the Land of Enchantment, I will look you guys up.
Please do.
I shall, and I thank you, Craig. You did a great job. Jessica, thank you for organizing this.
Thank you so much.
And for inviting me.